Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Karen Renaud's inaugural lecture. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nigel Seaton, the principal of the university. This is the second of a series of lectures in which our newly appointed professors set out their academic stall, as we might put it, as they tell us something about what interests them and what they're passionate about. An inaugural lecture is an important event in the life of any university, certainly as at Abertay. It's an event with a long and actually ancient tradition as new professors introduce themselves to their scholarly community and to the wider community by professing their subject. It's a pleasure to have so many people from the university and from the wider community with us here today. I would like to welcome particularly Karen's family and friends whom I had a chance to meet earlier on. So welcome particularly to you, to the university and to Karen's lecture. Just a few words about Karen by way of introduction. Karen is a South African and a graduate of the University of Pretoria, the University of South Africa, and a university a bit closer to hand, the University of Glasgow. She's had academic posts at the University of South Africa and most recently at the University of Glasgow, and has been a visiting scholar at Mississippi State University. In her international travels, Karen has not left behind her native country and, among many continuing connections, has been awarded the honorary post of Professor Extraordinaire, which is a wonderful thing to be. I've never been one. I'm sure it's a wonderful thing, and it is a wonderful thing, at the University of South Africa. Karen's interests, as we will hear this evening, are in human-centered security and specifically in improving the usability and acceptability of security systems and software. Karen takes an interdisciplinary approach to her work. Actually, we're quite used to this at Abertay. It's one of our things, really. We're pretty good at crossing discipline boundaries. But Karen's interests, I would say, roam particularly widely as she brings in insights from many places, including, for example, behavioral economics and industrial safety. These are areas that she described to me as nothing to do with computer science, although I suppose another way to put it would be that everything is to do with computer science. Indeed, Karen is interested in almost everything. I'm not sure about the almost, but let's say almost everything. And she's certainly interested in anything that might help us better to understand the interaction between human beings and cybersecurity. Karen's lecture, as you can see, from my thumb having been stopped, I'm going to tell you what it is, but it's on the screen. Cybersecurity, blame is not the name of the game. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I would like to thank first Professor Seaton for his introduction, and then Gregor in his absence. Gregor was not able to be here today, and Natalie for welcoming me to the Division of Cybersecurity, and indeed all my colleagues, my new colleagues in the School of Design and Informatics, for really making me feel so welcome at Abertay in my short time here. I do feel that I'm becoming part of the Abertay family. Jill Dempster too must get some thanks from me because she's organized this very professionally and she's calmed me down every time I started getting a bit worried. And I'd like to especially thank the student helpers who have given up their evening to help with this. Now, Jill, instructions to me were tell people about your research, but also make sure you mention the people who have helped you along the way. And so I'm going to start by thanking, and I'll probably end by thanking as well. These are the men in my life. If you could cut me open and look to my core, you would find these four guys there. I could not have done anything that I have done without their love, support, and encouragement, and it means a great deal to me that I have the four of them here tonight, seeing their mum in action. Someone else who's very important to me is my sister, who's flown in, especially all the way from England, to come and support me today, and that means a great deal to me as well. And then someone else who is also not a blood relative, but might as well be because she feels like a sister, Alison, who also came from darkest England to come see the Scotland today. So thank you for all of you. But let me tell you where my interest started. My father bought this calculator when I was 16 years old. Now, he took a loan to buy it because in those days it was really expensive, but my father was the original technophile who had to have all the latest things. Well, I quickly appropriated this, put it in my bedroom, and I loved this thing because I could program this. And you see the little printer? You could print your programs out. Now, you had to print them out because when you took the battery out to charge it, it just wiped the whole memory. Now that sounds really primitive to you, but think about the fact that this girl had never, ever had that kind of technology in their hands before. Having that piece of technology persuaded me that I should go and do a computing science degree. So I went to the University of Pretoria, which is one of the top universities in South Africa. I was really lucky it was in my hometown, and I went there to do a 4-year honours degree. Having done that, I decided not to continue in academia, and I went to work on an iron ore mine. Now, this is a huge open cast mine. It's 1 kilometre long and 0.5 kilometre wide when I worked there. And I worked in a team of 4 people, and we told those trucks where to go on the mine. Now, you can see how big those things are. They don't reverse. You tell them to go the wrong way, they're going to go the wrong way. And they carry 150 tons, and you had to tell them where to go and fetch iron ore and where to dump it. Now, the iron ore in that mine is the richest in the world. It's 65% iron ore, some of it, but some of it was really rubbishy iron ore. And if you messed up where you sent it, you would just wreck the whole processing of the iron ore. So we had to get it right. And we used a computer less powerful than the one you're carrying in your pocket today. So it was quite a feat. What I learned here was I was so enraptured by the software and by being so absolutely tied up with being able to produce all this wonderful stuff that I never thought of the end user. And it's not, I mean, I wasn't particularly unusual in that respect. I didn't even have a human-centered security course at my university. And when we delivered the system after 2 years of development, they were not impressed. That was a real shock. I mean, aren't you as impressed by what I've managed to produce? No, we don't like it. That was a shock, and that was a real eye-opener for me. Then, because the idea of maternity leave hadn't quite reached South Africa yet, I kind of abandoned the job market for a few years to have my 3 wonderful sons. And I appeared again in 1990. And suddenly cybersecurity had become a thing. When we worked on the mine, there were no passwords. You had to get physical access to a computer to use it. And so that's easy because we're good at doing physical security. We as humanity have been doing that for hundreds of years. But I was issued, when I started my job at the University of South Africa, a password, and I was told I had to change it every 30 days. And very quickly, you began to see this kind of thing. This is not unusual. Then the web came along, and every web developer made their own mind up about what a password should look like. And so you have some very confused users out there going, oh my goodness, I have to remember all these different passwords with all these different requirements. What am I supposed to do? Then the 2010s rolled around, and every one of us is carrying a huge computer in our pockets. And we're supposed to update them because people keep finding holes. But when you update it, what happens? It breaks some of your apps, or it uses up too much memory. It doesn't work very well. And the Federal Trade Commission in the US has recently published a report saying that the mobile phone providers better get their act together because this is not good enough. People are not patching. They're vulnerable because of the way this thing has been designed. But the worst design, as far as I'm concerned, is email. So this is an email I got from PayPal. And because I'm security-minded, I examine everything really carefully. I'm not saying they couldn't catch me, but I'm careful. Now, at the top is a URL that looks okay. But what they really want you to do is click on that button. And now, a different URL. Now, think about the fact that your eye is focusing on that button, but the email provider displays that URL at the bottom. So unless you're like me and you're slightly worried about these things, you might not even go and look at that bottom URL, and you might just click. But I did look, and that's what I discovered. And then I was really, really worried, because those URLs are 2 different URLs. And what is this? PayPal communication. Is that some hacker website? I don't know. So I didn't click, because I'm slightly suspicious. But in fact, I didn't Google, and that is actually a valid URL owned by PayPal. So the problem is that, number one, the email providers are displaying the really vital information in the wrong place, so the design is very bad. And in the second place, companies like PayPal are misbehaving because they're training people to click on emails that should be suspicious. So, the industry is not doing too well. But despite all that, with all these errors I could see, you see this kind of cartoon, that if only we could just keep the users out of things, we would have security. It's the jolly user that always makes mistakes. And this launched me on my journey. And I'm going to tell you about my journey in 3 acts tonight. But before that, I was a hardcore software engineer, architecting systems and just playing wonderful games in my mind with programming and so on. But then I was launched into this new career. So the first thing I wanted to do, I thought, right, the problem with passwords is not being able to remember them. Could I come up with a way that somebody could record a password in the open, but someone else getting hold of that record couldn't figure out what the password was? So this is the scheme we came up with. I worked with Elmay Smith at the University of South Africa. So the first thing you do is you find an image like this. It's got lots of potential hooks that you can remember. So humans are very good at remembering positions in 2D spaces. So that's easy. So let's assume that somebody picks that hook. That's something they're going to easily remember, that anchor. You then superimpose a grid over it. You then ask somebody to choose one of a variety of colored templates. And then you ask them for their PIN, and you put it in there. Then you populate the rest of the grid with a bunch of rubbish. And you remove that, and the person prints that. Okay, now they have some little colored templates, which they then, that printout can go up against the wall, and they have their little colored templates, and all they have to do is secure the templates, and then can have all this stuff. So we kind of achieved our aim of recording things in the open without people necessarily being able to get hold of them. So my father still has that picture on his study wall, but the problem was my father was the only person who would use my system. So that wasn't exactly what I was hoping to achieve. People found it clunky, and people said, it's so much easier just to use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Why would we use something complicated like this? So then I worked with Antonella D'Angeli, who was working at NCR at the time here in Dundee. And we said, well, how about if we replaced the password with the system that I'd come up with? So I then converted the system so that people could use a hook and then put a template on it, reveal their password, and say to the system, yeah, that's my password, and they would be able to log in. So now we were kind of going down the route of replacing passwords. And we used a map of Europe because I figured that most people in the UK run away to get sun sometime during the year. And so they would have some memories of places in Europe to use as anchors. So the students used this for 3 months to access some supplementary material I was giving them for one of their courses. And at the end of it, we analyzed everything. And we discovered, actually, although there are hundreds of cities, most of my students use Glasgow or Edinburgh. Okay, so you learn, you live and learn. So that meant that this system was not, and also most people use the yellow template because they start on the left. So that wasn't secure enough, and it's never going to be a password replacement. So back to the drawing board, and we thought, well, was there a way we could queue people's passwords, some sort of queue we could display next to the password field that only that person would understand that queue? And so I had a master student called Tony McBrien, and he came up with the idea of an ink blot. We all see different things in ink blots. And so what he did was you had a little ink blot engine, and you kept clicking until you could see something in that ink blot. And then every time when you returned to log in, see if this pointer thingy works, right? That would be displayed, and you would see the thing you'd seen in it last time, and you could then enter your password. I mean, these things are always wonderful ideas. So I once again got the students to use this for 3 months, and at the end of the day, we interviewed them, and they said, yeah, but we just use passwords from other systems. We don't look at your Q blots. Okay, so students don't want my help. Right. So then Antonella and her team at NCR had come up with this mechanism to replace numbers on ATM machines. Now, you won't see this because they also had this problem of acceptability by users, but that was her idea. And I thought, well, what could I use? Some different kind of image. Could we try something different here? And the problem as well is that people would, the 4 out of 10 images is not terribly secure. And so what we came up with was that people could draw us a doodle. Now, this is not very, very guessable because doodles are very simple and people don't remember what other people can't predict what you've drawn. And so you display those 4 sets of images and a person would just pick their one. That turned out to be really good. It wasn't easy to guess what people had done, and the students liked it, people used it, there were no problems. But of course the snag is that I'm a researcher, and I spent a lot of time scanning all those little doodles off pieces of paper. Industry's not going to do that. And besides which, somebody looking over my shoulder can see those 4 images, they've got your password. Big snag of graphical authentication mechanisms. So the final one, and I'm giving you a snapshot, we tried lots and lots of things, but this one we thought, well, what about if observing wasn't helpful? What about if people were not identifying their PIN, but identifying their handwriting? How many people's numerals can you identify? Because you don't see that stuff anymore. We're all communicating by computers these days. And this seemed really cool, and I can tell you right now which is my handwriting on that one without any difficulty. And so, you know, we had the scheme. But once again, you'd have to have a company that was prepared to scan every customer's numerals in and generate this kind of thing. It just wasn't feasible. So it got to the point where we're going, nah. Graphical authentication, it's an idea whose time to expire has come. And there was something at the edge of my consciousness was bothering me, but I couldn't quite get a handle on it. So then I kind of moved away from the users, and I said, well, I spent a year working at an NHS health board, interviewing the nurses, the social workers, the doctors, everyone who was working there. And what I asked them was, tell me about the security policies that you are constrained by. And they were, you know, that picture depicts the response very well. They were utterly frustrated. They said, the people who make these policies don't understand our jobs. They're asking us to do stuff that's completely impossible. So the nurses, for example, all the nurses are sharing one computer and running back and forth to help these patients. And they're telling us to log off all the time and log back in all the time. They say it's just not possible. So we don't. We just, the first person to arrive in the morning logs on. And then the information governance people come around and they give us a hard time about it. They don't understand. The patients are more important than the stupid password. Right. So I got this and I fed this back to the top. And they went, yeah, you're right. But we've got auditors. We can't change the rules. So frustration, sorry, but that's the way it is. Now, that was another lesson for me, that, you know, it's all very well in my ivory tower to say we shouldn't do stuff this way, but actually getting people to take the risk of not doing it an established way is a completely different thing. But I had some questions about security policies that kept bothering me. Why do we force people to change passwords after a month, after 3 months? How do we choose those numbers? Why 30 days? Why 90 days? Why a year? Nobody could tell me. Why do we lock people out after 3 times? The 3 wrong passwords. Why don't we let them try 5 times? Why don't we let them try 7 times? Where did that come from? And finally, how much security does a stronger password get you? Because it's jolly well expensive for the end user. Can we tell them exactly how much more secure they're going to be? Well, I couldn't get anyone in the industry to let me fiddle about with their stuff, so I built a simulation engine. Right, I could play in this playground without bothering anybody. So what I did was I wanted to simulate password behavior amongst a group of people who are constrained by a particular policy, and then crank up the requirements, you know, force people to have 13-character passwords or 15-character passwords, and see what happens, because we know what the forgetting rate is for that sort of stuff. We know how many people write passwords down. We know how many people share passwords. By the way, in teams, that's about 64%, and that does not change. Anywhere I've been, about 64% of people who work in close teams will share their passwords with each other. But anyway, that's by the by. So this is what the engine looks like, and it's totally configurable. The number of users, the number of employees in your company, the number of systems that an hacker, an outside hacker is supposed to get hold of, the number of hackers, everything is configurable. And I gave this to my students to use for 2 years. And I said to them, play with the policy things. Crank this up, loosen that, and see what happens to it, because what it spat out at the end was how many users have been locked out and they weren't able to work, and how secure were the systems at the end of the day. All right, so this was really good as a teaching tool, because the students really got a feel for it. And you can ask somebody in the front row who actually used this tool what he thought of it when I'm not listening. So according to SimPass, because I then did a big experiment with a friend of mine called Roseanne English, and we tested it. And what we found that the sweet spot is actually 5 times before you lock people out. And that balances perfectly the number of people who get locked out of their accounts and therefore cannot be productive, and the security of the underlying system. So just giving people 2 more tries makes it more likely that they will remember what their stupid password is. But I mean, there was no way any company was going to let me do this, because they're scared. They're scared of being fingers pointed at them if they get hacked. And they go, yep, it's because you changed that lockout. So once again, you know, frustration. But the thing at the edge of our consciousness kept on bothering me. And then I launched myself into the field of behavioral economics, which is absolutely fascinating. The economists eventually realized that humans have emotions, and they started to write these kind of things. Now, I don't know if you remember that Richard Thaler got a Nobel Prize for his work. He's the author of the book on the right, one of the authors, for his work in behavioral economics. But this stuff was fascinating, and it has been used really successfully. Generally, it's just a little visual kind of a tweak to the environment that makes you take the wiser course of action. It's not anything heavyweight. So it's been used very successfully. So if you identify as fat, go ahead, use the escalator, right? And other people will see that you identify as fat. Right. Now I took this picture out of the train window at Charing Cross Station. This is an information point, which is fine. But I would have thought they could have made that emergency button red, don't you think? And in the second place, you have to understand and be able to read English. And if somebody's dying in front of you and you don't read English, what are you supposed to do? But I discovered this one from Korea. What a wonderful nudge. Nobody's going to make a mistake, right? And it's so simple to do this if you think about it, right? And this one is all over Glasgow. I don't drive around Dundee. I don't know if they're here. But this has been proven by research studies to work. Now, if you think about what you're actually giving somebody, it's a smiley face, for goodness sake. But it works. It gets people to reduce their speed. So, of course, in the back of my mind was, could we nudge people towards stronger passwords? We don't get all hardcore with them, but just, come on, just tweak you that way. Right, okay. I obviously wasn't the first one to think about this. You've all seen this when you log in to some websites. Right, this is how strong your password is. Now, all the research studies that have been done on this have shown they actually don't work. You don't get stronger passwords at the end of the day. I mean, it feels good, it feels like you're doing something, but it doesn't work. So I built a website for all the students in our school where they could access their coursework grades, they could see their deadlines, they do various bits and pieces that were all local to our school. And then I had about 600 students to do an experiment with. And so I took them and I randomly allocated them to different groups. So when they logged in, depending on the group they've been allocated to, they would see a different visual nudge just above where they enter the password. And what I wanted to see was what I displayed there going to persuade these folks to go to stronger passwords? So the first one is the graph on the top left. Now that is a very strong behavioral economics finding, is that people respond to expectations. And so what we're saying is most students will choose strength there in the middle in the red bit, but in fact, the university guidelines want you to be in the green zone, right? That was one group. The next group had this graph at the top, the right. The students in this school choose the strongest passwords. That's a very strong appeal to the in-group effect. Then we had another two groups. Instead of just letting them guess, we gave them a little arrow that kind of moved this little way across as they typed the password in, so they could see how strong their password was. And we did that with both graphs. Then we needed something else to do, because we had all those wonderful students to work with. I don't know if you've seen this. This is a lot of bicycle places where you park bikes in Glasgow have this, and this reduces bike theft. Don't ask me how, it's just a sticker on the wall, but it reduces bike theft. And that's a behavioral economics finding as well. So my last group, I displayed that pair of eyes above the password field to see if that would persuade something. And what did I find? I found a dead parrot situation. There was just nothing happening. The password strength was not budging. So I sat down with a friend of mine from Darmstadt University, and we designed what we called an enriched nudge. So we were going to give this nudge a bit more power. And her name is Verena Zimmermann. And we said, we're going to have a nudge, but we're going to add a carrot and a prod. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So I promised Lorna a sausage dog tonight, and Lorna's got her sausage dog. So the nudge is an elongated sausage dog. I artificially made him as long as I could. That says, the stronger your password, the longer you can keep it. The carrot was, as they're typing it in, you could see how long that password is going to be valid for, right? So the students were actually getting something back for the effort they were putting in. And the last one was, every time they logged in, I didn't nag them, but I gave them a little prod. You know your password's expiring soon. You might want to think about changing it. And what did I find? Wonderful, wunderbar. We got stronger passwords. We compared the passwords to the entire cohort on the previous year, significantly stronger passes. We were really, really happy. Until we looked at the data a little bit more and discovered that a third of the students had forgotten their passwords. It made me feel sick. I did not want to make people's lives worse. And somehow I had completely compromised the usability of the system, which was not my aim. And then I sat back and I realized that I'd started with the users, and then I'd gone to managed security. So I started trying to make things more usable. Then I'd gone to managed security, and then I'd gone to behavioral security. But actually I was blaming, I was focusing on the users again. What's next? So I decided to go to my peers. I went to every security conference that I went to. I asked the organizers, would they send this questionnaire out to the people attending? Now remember, these are industry security people and security people, people who do research the way I do. And I want to ask them 2 questions. Why do people behave insecurely? And what should we do about it? So this is what they told me. They're lazy, indifferent, stupid. This was not good. This is what security people think of users. But I had asked them as well, so how do we solve it? And they said, well, they don't know, and that's true. So tell them, and then they're just going to do it. Or they don't know the consequences, so scare the heck out of them. Or they don't care, so just jolly well compel them. So let's examine each of these in point. Companies spend a great deal of their time and money training their employees, and indeed they should, because this field moves very, very fast, and we have to help people to keep up. But we cannot assume that that will get us to secure behavior. It's merely a first point, a first step. And I'll demonstrate that for you from another field. We have known, and medics have known for over 150 years, that they should wash their hands between patients. But this study, and there are others if you go and search, demonstrates that medics are still not doing it. In 2011, that study came from. What's going on? We don't know until we go and try to figure it out. But the point is, there's a lot of steps between knowing and doing. Okay, and that's really important to remember. So knowing, absolutely, we've got to do this, but we need to do more. So shall we just scare them? Well, it turns out that there's some really interesting literature about, because intuitively, this is what I thought we had to do as well for a long time. Go to an SME, do you know how many SMEs got attacked last year? And think they're going to magically listen. Well, Jeremy Bentham was a very famous philosopher who lived in the 1700s, sorry. And he was a very keen observer of people, and he said that we are driven by pain and pleasure. We run away from pain, we run towards pleasure. I don't know about you, but last time somebody tried to scare me, that was not a pleasurable experience. And so, okay. But Jeremy wasn't able to look inside people's heads. However, Tali Sharot is a neuropsychologist, and she can look in your head, but she sticks you on an MRI machine. And they discovered that when you try to scare people, they freeze, or they try to get out of the situation. But what she was doing was confirming what Jeremy Bentham was saying. Yeah, you can try to scare people into action, but you're just going to scare them to run away. They'll stick their heads in the sand or something. And John Bargh, who's a psychologist, has recently published a book this month that says that actually, if you make people afraid, you make them resistant to changing anything. Right? So these things are telling us, and he's done a lot of experiments with people, not asking them, but actually watching what it is they're doing. Now, I have a picture here that shows me that trying to scare people doesn't work. I'm pretty scared of electricity and water mixing, but clearly these 3 guys are not. And I don't get that. I don't get it at all. Okay, so we're not going to scare people. What about just jolly well telling them what to do and expecting them to do it? Make the rules, tell people to follow it, put it in their faces. Well, I have some examples. My husband took this picture at a tidal pool in South Africa. And you'll see what a mishmash it is. It tells you what not to do, it warns you about things, and it also tells you that they examine the thing every few months or whatever. But the best part of this is the very last one. Do not release sharks into tidal pools. Now, what kind of person puts a shark into a tidal pool, and would they be stopped by that rule? I doubt it. Okay. But then I found an even better one this week. Who puts a waffle? Come on. And is that kind of person going to be stopped by a rule? I rest my case. Rules are not going to work. And even worse, When you make too many rules and you constrain people too much, you destroy their trust in the organization. Nobody wants an organization where nobody's trusting anybody anymore. It's damaging. So we're not scaring, we're not compelling. And in terms of telling, it's the first step. Guys, it's not going to get us all the way there. It's not merely awareness raising as much as we want to be. What's really important to your users? I'll tell you, achieving their goals. We all want to achieve our goals. Whether that goal is jolly well reading our email, or whether that goal is being a nurse or a doctor or writing a report. That's what's important. And what is actually happening when I asked my peers was that the goals are different. As security researchers, we're just interested in this stuff. And we don't get the fact that the guys, the users, they want to do their jobs, for goodness sake. So then I started to read psychology. And I started to think, what is there? You know, our brains are much bigger than they used to be way back in evolution. What's happening in that head? Now, this is one of the most important slides in my talk, because this is really important when it comes to security. Daniel Kahneman, another Nobel Prize winner, got the Nobel Prize for revealing this, that your brain has two parts, System 1 and System 2. And you're not aware of System 1 most of the time. It works invisibly without you intending, without you prompting it. It just works. It triggers things happening. And the System 2 is your conscious brain. It's the thing you're in control of. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not your fault if you do something daft. But what it does mean is that we have to acknowledge the fact that the System 1 brain is down there and it's operating. And often, the System 1 brain will click into play long before you've even realized it. And they've done some research, once again, putting people into MRI machines and asking them to make a decision. And they're able to detect the direction the decision is going to go 7 seconds before you are aware of the way you're going to. So they say to people, press the left button, the right button, tell me when you've decided. And when the person says they've decided, the researchers 7 seconds before already knew which way they were going to decide. The fact that we don't know about the System 1 functioning does not mean it's not there. It is there. And it's not like we don't have free will. Those two systems are interacting all the time. What does this mean? So that most of what you do can be triggered by the System 2 brain, which is kind of under the surface, and most of what you know comes in the top. It turns out when your eye sees something, it goes to both sides of your brain at the same time. Now, I don't know if you've ever been driving and you slam the brake before you realize why you've slammed the brake, and then you realize something in your peripheral vision is coming in. And that's happened to me. And that's your System 1 brain protecting you from having a crash. Okay? And that's the kind of thing that happens. Now, let's think about a person who's been clicking on emails all day. When they get to that phishing email at 4:30 in the afternoon, and they've been opening links all day, 7 seconds before the top of the brain says, whoa, be careful, they've clicked. So telling people to be careful. So is it our humanity? Was that the thing at the back of my mind that kept bothering me? Partly, but there was something else. So the next thing I did in my search for enlightenment was to go and look at reports of hacks. Now, in 2013, Twitter got hacked. And what was really interesting to me was not the fact that they got hacked, that happens, but they got hacked basically because people got into the system and just stole the whole database, right? It wasn't anybody's user account. It wasn't somebody who used a useless password. That's really important to know. Because when I read the comments, immediately people got blamed for poor password behavior. I thought, where did that pointing finger come from? It wasn't any user's fault that they got hacked. That's just crazy. And then this happened to everybody last year. You all remember WannaCry? What an incredible experience that was to be in the grip of WannaCry. What happened? The very first report blamed a user for clicking on a phishing link. And in fact, that's not what caused WannaCry. That's the one thing that didn't cause WannaCry. And so I realized the real problem is the way we respond to cyber incidents. We try to find somebody to scapegoat, and we pick on them without actually understanding. And so the problem that was bothering me all the time was the blaming. Because blaming is very corrosive, very divisive in any organization. And the real problem with blaming is that it inhibits anybody thinking about what they did and learning from it, because they're so busy defending themselves from being blamed. Judging doesn't explain why it happened. So if you judge and you fire somebody, the next person you put in that position is likely to fall into the same hole. So Sidney Decker was the next person to get my attention, and he writes a lot about safety, and he has published a number of books called Safety Differently. And he says you can learn what has gone wrong, or you can blame, but you cannot do both, which is why blaming is so corrosive. So my next step was, so how do we learn from him? How do we currently do security? We tell people, always be careful. But that's not possible. It's not the way our brains operate. Most of the time, we're functioning at the bottom of our brain because it's nice and fast, the system one, all the processes that we have automated in our lives operate all nicely there out of our conscious control. And you know what? If you tried to operate completely in your system 2 brain, you'd be exhausted by 10 o'clock in the morning. We have to use that part of the brain because it's very efficient. So the hair is where we like working. Do you know that your brain is about 3% of your body weight, but it uses 20% of your energy? So it's a very expensive organ. So of course you're going to try to be efficient by letting that system 2 brain click in and do things for you. And cybersecurity is in trouble. I mean, we are really in trouble. Not a week goes by before you see another. Do you all remember the Talk hack, I'm sure? Ashley Madison, Equifax, just about every American, and just about every South African. All their details given away to hackers. This is a sign that we're doing it wrong. It's not just awareness, and most of those were not end users. So I'm going to make the argument that people do not fail at security. Security is failing end users. We are doing security wrong. And I promised one of my sons I would make a way to get Blackadder on this slideshow. So this is my eventual direction. This is the destination where I am now. I went to searching. Why do accidents happen? What is going on? And what was really interesting, I discovered James Reason's book on human error. And James Reason says that when something goes wrong, it's like all the holes in the Swiss cheese lining up. If one of those holes is out of place, you're not going to get an incident. But you'll think everything's okay, but those other holes are there. And the day will come when they're all aligned, you're going to get a cybersecurity incident. That's interesting because we've been blaming the person at the end point a lot of the time. We blame the user. And think about WannaCry. Those are all valid reasons for WannaCry, but you won't see the end user there. The NSA created the tools and then lost them. People left the ports open. They weren't patched. There were all these reasons why WannaCry happened. Is it helpful to go and blame some poor information governance officer for not patching? No, it's not helpful. You need to understand why he didn't patch. You need to figure out why the governance failed so you can fix it. The minute you point a finger at some poor guy, you're not going to get his help anymore. So I believe that human-centered cybersecurity is really hard because it's complex. It's not complicated, it's complex. A lot of the time, we don't even know what's going on in there. The scale of incidents sometimes is so huge and comes from so many directions that it's really hard to make a set of rules that can encompass how to respond. And what you really want, it's an emergent property. What you really, really need is for your employees to have the flexibility to be able to respond when something bad goes wrong. Now, then I read a bit more of Sidney Decker's work, and I realized what I'd been doing wrong. In my attempt to help users, I was considering them the problem. And Sidney Decker says, no. Your employees are not the problem. They're the solution. If you train them right and you give them enough room, they will solve the problems because humans are very good at coming up with problem-solving solutions if you allow them to stretch that way. So human-centered security, really, we need to kind of get our heads around the fact that actually the employer is not at the other end of the boxing ring. He's here with the technology. At the other end is the hacker. That's the enemy. And we've got to start harnessing the abilities of the end users. Ask them what they need. Don't keep putting barriers in their way. And build their positive capabilities. Make sure they're upskilled. Make sure they stay up to date. And I have done the ABCs of the previous way of doing security is always be careful. I'm going to do ABCDE of the way I think we need to move forward. The first one is we have to give people the autonomy. We have to give them autonomy to disobey the rules if they're needing to respond to a cybersecurity incident. Allow them the flexibility to solve the problem on the fly. I think that's really important. But clearly that's not going to work. You still have to have the upskilling. And the upskilling is the B. We have to build resilience in our employees. Security awareness is not a vaccination. It's a journey. And you have to bring all the employees with you and help them to understand why these things need to be done. And really, get that resilience from getting expertise built in. And not compliance that requires people telling people just obey these rules, because your rules are going to be updated within a month, right? Because the hackers keep changing their techniques. It's like being on shifting sand. Technology's moving at breakneck speed. The hackers are changing. You can't encapsulate in rules. It's too complex. So what you have to do is let people understand the business value of cybersecurity. Get everybody on board. You know what? This company will not survive unless we can be compliant with Cyber Essentials or whatever. Get them to understand that and get everyone to be committed. Because when you make rules, cybersecurity becomes the IT department's problem and the IT department's job. And that's when things start going wrong. But if everyone understands that it's everyone's job and that they're never going to get fingers pointed at them, you might get everyone on board and committed. Design is really important. Somebody mentioned this at the round table earlier. We have to start designing for humans. Now, there's a thing called humans are better at, machines are better at. So what are machines? Remembering rubbish, nonsense passwords that are 128 characters long. So give people a password manager or a hardware. That's the hardware one. It goes on your keyring, and the bottom one is a software one. I went to visit Duke University last year, and they give all their employees a free subscription to a password manager. Their weak passwords went away. They don't have that problem anymore. Isn't that a simple solution? Much better than beating people over the head to make stronger passwords. And on the left is a text my husband got. And I didn't even look at the URL. I told him Ryanair gives nothing away. There's something wrong with that text. And then I noticed, I don't know if you can see, there on top of the A is a little accent, so that's a phishing email. I told him not to click on it. But it wasn't examining that gave me the clue. It was knowing about Ryanair. No computer's going to know that stuff. The final one is we have to try to engage that unconscious part of the brain. And how do we do that? I'm sorry. We have to tell stories. We have to let people, the story I told you about Ryanair, I think you might remember that because it got a laugh and you might, it's humorous. So we need to, when people manage to foil hackers, we need to let them talk about it and tell people. And so those positive stories become part of the organization's narrative. That engages the hair of your part of your brain because that's where your emotions come from. It kind of sneaks the message in so that people remember it. So the ABCs for me are to build autonomy, give autonomy, and avoid blaming people because it's so corrosive. Building resilience, collaboration and commitment being the name of the game instead of compliance. Design security better, but we all know that already. And tell stories. And if something happens, for goodness sake, figure out what went wrong. Don't try and find a who. Now, in security, I'm just going to give you some example of how they've done this in safety. There's a Dutch town called Drachten. And Drachten had this intersection where lots of people were getting hurt all the time. And the way they tried to deal with it was, you can see they painted it and they put lots of traffic lights and gave people fines if they went speeding. But the fatality rate it wasn't as bad as the injuries, but people were just getting hurt all the time. And so there was a very far-seeing guy in charge of traffic, and he said, okay, I'm removing everything. And he said, right, anyone can just walk into this intersection now. The fatalities went down to 0, and only one person a year now gets hurt. How's this? We've taken the rules away. But what happens is that people start understanding that this is a shared space and that they must respect the slowest member. And so the cars start moving as slowly as the slowest person in the intersection, and the accidents went away. That was a really powerful lesson for me. So I'm going to end off by saying that I believe that my journey actually, after having gone this long journey of blaming the user, I'm now starting a new journey of figuring out how to help organizations see people as the solution, because you can't just tell people. In South Africa, there's a word called Ubuntu, and Ubuntu means I am because we are. And if we can understand that we're all in this together, You know, the people sitting in the circle, you're not going to pick one of them out to blame. We're all in this together. We're in a battle against millions of hackers. And we can't do this alone. We have to do this with our colleagues. Now, when I started, I was going to start with the thanks, and I'm going to end with the thanks, because the many, many people have made a tremendous impact on my life. Some of them don't know me. Some I've been privileged enough to meet, and some are very close to me, have grown up, that I've grown up with. And I'm just going to provide some photographs here. The top left is Dan Ariely, who I was really privileged to meet when I visited Duke University. But those three people really made the strongest impact on my life. The top is my grandmother, who bought me my very first book. And I still remember it was Rupert the Bear. And she opened a world to me. Right? She opened the world of curiosity and the world of discovery. And she taught me how to love and how to have empathy for other people. So, you know, and she wasn't an academic. She left school when she was 12. But you can still have an impact on other people's lives by just giving the right input at the right time. This is my uncle, who was a statistics lecturer. And the lesson he taught me was, never forget your students. Research is really important, but the students should come before the research, because you can make a major impact on their lives. And they've got a whole career in front of them. Don't neglect them. That was a very powerful lesson for me. And that's my aunt on the right. Just was there, the smartest woman I have met in my entire life, but wore her cleverness very, you know, humbly, and always was there to support me. And those three people made the strongest impact on my life, and that has nothing to do with all the academic stuff that I did. Finally, I want to introduce Tammy. Tammy is the dog who inspired the little nudge that could. Thank you very much for your attention.
You now have time for a few questions. Could I just say there are microphones, which will help if you put your hand up, a microphone will come to you. Can I, sorry, I was going to ask, yeah, I'll start with something. I was struck, maybe it's because of the kind of, I'm a hypocrite. I walked away from the microphone and said, wait for the microphone. I was struck by how, maybe it's a job I do, but quite a lot of what you talked about, blame and learning, you can have one or the other. You could almost, it seemed to me, you could translate lessons of that to organisations, for example. Because a lot of that I could imagine would work. I mean, is there literature on that as well about, particularly about the role of blame or the negative impact of blame?
There's a guy called Peter Drucker who's very, and that's exactly what he says. I just didn't have time for his slide, so I cut it. But that's what he says. He says the same things as Jam Reason is saying. That's fine, you can scapegoat somebody, but that problem will happen again because you haven't figured out why exactly. But all the literature I read on blame is how unbelievably damaging it is, not just to the person, but to the whole organization, which is why I think we have to, every time I hear people blaming users, it kind of sits inside me.
Natalie, do you have a question?
Thank you, Karen. That was a really, really interesting talk.
Good.
I just wondered how ready you think industry are to actually be able to, respond to this and make sure that, it's not a case of the user is wrong, but actually looking at what they can do to help. I think for so long we have been blaming the user, and I just wondered if industry are, aware that they are getting it wrong, and if there's anything that we can do to help them, look at it a different way.
This is probably going to be the rest of my career trying to figure that out. It's really hard to change a paradigm. It took safety 50 years. I don't want security to be doing the wrong thing for 50 years. I think we have to figure out how to sell it. And part of that is I've just given a broad brush. We have to find a way to really package this nicely. And being able to show that Drachten example, that's where it's been done and it worked. If we had one organization that was prepared to kind of change things, then we'd have an example and people might, not to scare them, but it's a positive story. And I just hope I can find an organization like that. And it's hard, because of blame, it's hard. Yeah.
Other question? One over there.
Hi, Karen. It's just in response to what you were saying, you'd like an organisation. Matthew Said, who's one of our honorary fellows, honorary graduates, sorry, has done stuff on black box thinking, and that's exactly what he has said, is that he's worked with organisations in the aviation industry and also with the NHS, where you can't have that blame. People don't disclose things that have happened. They hide behind it because they're frightened that they're going to get into trouble. And if you take the NHS, it's a drug mistake, then people, they won't disclose, and therefore there's no learning. And so that's what he's worked with, is the NHS, to try and get out of that kind of sort of blame game, and so that people actually start to disclose, and that they can start to get to, say, the solutions that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's fantastic to hear that, that it's been confirmed in another field. So something I wanted to include, but I didn't have time for, was a few years ago, the NHS, the BBC got the details of all the adverse events that had happened in Scottish health boards, and I analysed all that data because I wanted to see what the responses were. I wanted to see not what had happened, but how the body that investigated, what their conclusions would be. And I discovered that in 49% of the cases, the person at the endpoint was blamed, which sort of felt very unfair in many cases, like the nurse who gave the wrong drug, the wrong strength of drug, because it was stored next to the right strength. And their response was, well, she should be more careful. No. The response is, label the thing properly so she doesn't make that mistake. It's not like the nurse wants to kill a child, And I think there is that blaming, but the NHS, I hope, is moving away from that. I really would like to see security stop blaming the user as well.